Great pleasure that we extend a warm welcome to all of you to Winter School 2023, Day 3, jointly organized by the Center for Development Economics, Delhi School of Economics, and the Econometric Society. We are honored to have with us Professor Joel Mokyr from Northwestern University. Our esteemed chair for the session is Professor T.C. Anand, ex-professor, Delhi School of Economics. Now, I would call upon Professor Anand to present the bouquet to Professor Mokyr and commence the session.
The camera person wants us to pose for it. Thank you. You can put it on the table itself. Well, good morning, friends. It's very nice to be back, and it's particularly nice to see that on a Saturday morning we've managed to get a reasonable crowd to attend a talk on economic history. I will take a minute or two before we start. I'm very pleased to see that the Winter School is flourishing and continuing something which started many years ago by us as an experiment. We wanted to create a mechanism by which we could allow scholars in India to meet with senior researchers, the best senior researchers from around the world, and also get a chance to talk about their work. It was a unique experiment at that time, and I am very glad that it has continued, because over the years, so many young scholars have come through these sessions, developed networks, gained connections, and gained an exposure which they have carried with them as part of their career. Delhi School is now, I think this is almost 30 plus years of the Winter School continuing. Our partnership with Econometric Society in particular has been extremely helpful in fostering this arrangement. So I'm very glad that this is taking place. I've been asked to introduce Professor Joel Mokyr. Professor Joel Mokyr needs no introduction. He's been a professor at Northwestern for many years. Many of those years he was chair of Northwestern. He was a chair when I was as a young graduate student finishing my dissertation and going on the job market. I did visit Northwestern at that time, but in addition to his long academic career, he's been extensively working in the field of economic history, particularly on issues related to the Industrial Revolution in Europe and its antecedents and causes. It's a topic which continues to remain of great interest, particularly today when there are changes taking place in the world, particularly with emergence of newer poles of growth in the East, especially as this talk seeks to explore the relationship with China. I look forward to hearing him, so I don't wish to spend time introducing Professor Mokyr, because his work speaks for itself, and he's been such a doyen in the field of mixing economics with history that he needs no introduction to us. So without much ado, Professor Mokyr.
Thank you. Before I start, 3 small notes. The first, I really want to say I hugely enjoyed this conference and being in Delhi, and I want to extend my particular gratitude to Shumendra Sarkar and to Mozumi Das, who have been exemplary hosts and who have made this conference for me not only fascinating and instructive, but also joyful. So I want to say thank you to both of you and to everybody else. Secondly, unlike the other 2 speakers that you've heard in the past 2 days, my 2 presentations today will be completely orthogonal to one another and completely disjoint subjects. So if you really hate this lecture, you don't really have a good excuse not to come this afternoon, because it will be a very different lecture. And finally, I habitually prepare too many slides, and so I probably won't get to the end. So if anybody here wants a copy of the full slide presentation, just send us an email, and I'll be glad to send it to you, and you can sort of see what you've missed. This is not a paper, this is a book. And when you present a book, obviously you really can't get into the weeds and into the details of the book. So much of the evidence and much of the documentation and the data on which this book is built, I will not be able to present, because I really want to give you a bit of an overview of what we're trying to do in this book. So my two co-authors, which are both, of course, senior scholars, Avner Greif from Stanford and Guido Tabellini from Bocconi, and you've surely all heard of them. So let's get going. So here's a simple but vexing historical question. In economic history, in the last, say, 15 years, we've had a small literature about persistence. And basically the idea is that if you have some kind of phenomenon that's heterogeneous over a particular country, over a particular region, centuries ago, sometimes that heterogeneity can still be detected to be correlated with conditions today. And so most famous papers of these are, possibly Melissa Dell's Econometrica paper on the Mita in Peru, or Voigtlander and Voss's paper on persecution of Jews in Germany, and the whole range of other papers, and one of them specifically I will talk about a little bit this afternoon. But so the question is economic history a story of persistences in which, whoever is ahead will stay ahead? Or is it a story of reversals of fortunes? Acemoglu and Robinson have a famous paper on reversal of fortune, in which they describe how, early in the history of the American continent, South America and the Caribbean were rich and the North was wild and poor, and that eventually that's reversed. And now today, of course, Northern American continent is much richer than the Caribbean and the South. And so which is it? Is it persistence or is it reversal? Both can be, both true. So here, this book is basically about what I would call the mother of all reversals. And that's essentially the relative position of Europe in terms of economic development, technological competence, and on and on and on, vis-a-vis the three great Asian civilizations, China, India, and the Middle East. Now, I will have very little to say about India or the Middle East in this talk. It will be almost exclusively about China. If we would have included India and the Middle East, we would need another 15 years and 500,000 words to take care of this. So probably that should be the next book or somebody else's next book. So this is going to be almost exclusively on the comparison between Europe and China, but basically the reversal holds for India and for the Middle East as well. So then why is it that when the world finally embarks on what is known now as the Great Enrichment, it was Europe and not China that was the source of it? So this book is this phenomenon is sometimes called, following Ken Pomerantz's famous book on the economic history of China called The Great Divergence. But a divergence, basically suggests that something, looks like this. You start from a similar point, and then one goes in one direction, one goes into the other direction. But this is really a reversal, because by 1000 AD or some arbitrary period around it, China was ahead in almost every field you would care about, and behind in all of them by 1900. And that's more than a divergence, ladies and gentlemen. That is a reversal. So here are at least 6 dimensions in which we can actually document this reversal quite easily. The most obvious, and the one that economists like most, and the one that's most dicey in terms of the quality of the data probably, is some estimate of GDP per capita, and then you can look at technological creativity, something close to my own heart, scientific progress, state capacity, urbanization, often taken as a measure of economic development, and military capability. And so all of those things, in all of those dimensions, we can be sure that the reversal took place. The big question, of course, is, in many cases, when did this exactly happen? And where did it exactly happen? But even deeper, and that's what this book is about, is why did it happen? So let me give you a little bit of this sort of underlying statistics, and then you'll see. So this is the divergence of GDP per capita. This is data that's compiled by Steve Broadberry and a bunch of collaborators. And you know what you really want to look at is this green line, which is China. And you can sort of see that it isn't so much that China really sharply declined until fairly late, let's say around 1700. You can see the Chinese decline. Before that, they basically just sort of sit there. There's a little bit of a rise during the Song here in this period, but otherwise, you know, it looks reasonably stationary. The big deal, of course, is the first, a higher level of income per capita that you see, even in countries that didn't grow very fast, like Italy, but in particularly, of course, the blue and this brown line, which are the most advanced European economies in the Low Countries and in Great Britain. Now, it's quite obvious that somewhere around 1000, say, even though the European data usually don't go back that far, income per capita in China was higher than it was in Europe. My sense is that's seriously understated, but that's a debate that I'm not going to get into right now. What is far better documented in some ways is the declining rate of innovation in China. And so we know that under the Song, which ended in the Song dynasty, which ended in 1279, the innovation rate started to decline. This was first brought to the world's attention in the sort of magisterial work done by an English medic of all people, Joseph Needham, who eventually became a sort of a Chinese historian of technology, and so Needham has this sort of, now I think there's something like 18 these big fat volumes and full of sort of excruciating detail about Chinese inventions, and he documents how sophisticated and how advanced China was, say, around the year 1000. But then, you know, people have looked at, basically tabulated the inventions that he mentions, and what is striking is that very few of them date from after 1200, and none after 1500, which is of course telling, because it's in 1500 approximately that you can sort of see around that period that you see European rate of invention starting to go up. And what's more, we actually can document something which we rarely see in history, but it does happen, which is technological retrogression, by which I mean essentially the techniques that were known to one generation are no longer known to another generation. That it does happen, and it happened in China in particular, with two areas that are sort of indicative. One is clockmaking, and the other is shipbuilding. And in both of them, it's easy to document that in fact they lost the ability to do things that they did in an earlier time. Now here is some more recent work. This is actually unpublished work by Yaxing Wang, and he's actually has a much larger database than the one that was compiled from Needham's work from Chinese sources. But you can basically see the same thing. Now he does this by dynasty, which may be, you know, highly nonlinear, so it sort of jumps around a little bit. But there's no question that from the peak, which he dates somewhat earlier, we see that essentially toward the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty, things are going down quite dramatically. Here's something quite different, but equally telling. This is state capacity as approximated by state revenue. And so on the left, you see, and then of course this is a fairly long period, but you can sort of see that in the year 1086, when we have good data, and that's you know, basically sort of essentially the middle point, so to speak, of medieval Europe, you see China is extracting something like 10% of its national income, and the Islamic civilization in Iraq under the Abbasids extracting, this is obviously 200 years earlier when they were at their peak, and they're extracting somewhere around 8%. And this is England here, and this here is France. So you can sort of see that this, obviously these states are barely extracting any revenues at all. Now this is 1800, so this is unusually high because this is early Meiji Japan, which is a sort of a special case. But here you see these European nations. There's England, which has a very high tax ratio. France, somewhat lower. United States. This is the Ottoman Empire, which is somewhere in the middle here. And here you have Qing China, which is around 1800. So you sort of see this is more than a divergence. This is a reversal in fortune. Here's one more. These data are very hard to interpret, but we did our best. This is the rate of urbanization. And you can sort of see that we're going over the same period. And the Chinese rate of urbanization is, roughly speaking, whatever you can say, about 3 or 4 observation points, but that's the best we can do. But you see there's not really a process of urbanization. It is not unurbanized. China has, of course, very large cities, and Europe in the year 1000 has very, very few. But you can sort of see what's happening in Europe, which is urbanizing very quickly. And this is really happening before the Industrial Revolution. And by 1800, again, the sort of great reversal is complete. So then, these data aren't good enough to exactly locate when it happened. And perhaps the question isn't well formulated in the first place. But the real question, perhaps, and that's what this book is after, is why. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about the kind of arguments that have been made. But if I surveyed them carefully, I would be busy for the next hour and a half and we never get to my stuff. But roughly speaking, the kind of explanations that you get for a phenomenon like this can be described as maps versus chaps. This is a phrase I borrowed from Ian Morris, who was a historian at Stanford. And, so maps basically says this is geography. Okay, so it has to do all with geography. So Ken Pomeranz, for instance, is a big maps guy. And if you look at his books, he basically says, China didn't do as well as Europe because of geographical factors. And he lists the sort of awkward placement of coal in China, and he lists the direction of the trade winds and things like that, which are sort of part of sort of physical geography. A somewhat different argument, but one that's quite interesting, was proposed by Thomas Tahelm at the University of Chicago, basically blaming the cultivation of rice for Chinese sort of culture, in the sense that rice requires a great deal of local collaboration, and it may therefore be responsible for China turning into a more collectivist culture. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The biggest of those geographical arguments, also this is the one where sort of maps meets chaps, so to speak, is the third one, which is that's an argument that has been made very widely. And essentially the argument is that China remained for much of its history and completely since 1279 a unified single country under one rule, whereas Europe remained fragmented and polycentric. And so we all know this. I mean, anybody who's looked at the map can look at how many different countries there are in Europe, some big, some not so big, but basically it's a very sort of fragmented kind of thing. And so the most recent book to make a big deal of that is Walter Scheidel's book, which is a big fat book that came out a couple of years ago. But this goes back all the way to sort of Eric Jones' classic book in 1981. But when you start sort of digging into it, you discover that actually people in the 18th century were already saying this, most specifically David Hume, who knew very little about China, but got most things right, which is very typical of David Hume, by the way, but that's a different story. But, but similar arguments have been made by Gibbon, by Kant, and so people in the 18th century already had this sense that being unified has its cost and being fragmented has its advantages. Now, there's a recent paper by Jesus Villaverde in the QJE that actually tries to combine that and try to make the fragmentation and the unified nature of the two civilizations an endogenous variable to geographical parameters. So, it's a very nice paper. It's sort of clever use of simulation technique. Now, about chaps, of course, there's an even wider range. And there's a whole long list of really learned people. First and foremost, Needham himself, but then Nathan Sivin and David Landis and Justin Ling, who look at different things in Chinese society, in Chinese culture, in Chinese values, and of course in Chinese politics, and basically say, well, this is the big difference between China and Europe. And I can make this list endlessly long. Most recently, a political scientist have got into debate. Here are two brand new books that have just come out. This one just came out last month. This came out maybe a year ago, and these are Chinese scholars working in the United States, both political scientists, and they basically sort of focus on these which you expect from political scientists, on political development and leading to some form of failure in China. Now, others have was entirely focused on cultural values. Here's a book by Peter Ball, who's a historian at Harvard, and basically blames philosophy, Neo-Confucian philosophy, which emerges in China in around the year 1000, so the timing is, roughly speaking, not bad. And so, essentially, Neo-Confucianism had become the dominant, I'm not sure if I call it religion, but certainly philosophy in China, and essentially remained so until the end of the empire. Before that, it was much more contestable. But in this system, Ball argues, interpersonal relations, including things like cooperation, were to be governed by things like filial loyalty, a strict gender hierarchy, respect between relatives, and emphasizing ancestor worship. I'll come to all of those. But basically, for people like that, this is the core of Chinese society, and that it was conservative, it was backward-looking, and as a result, social progress of any kind was becoming more and more unlikely. So our book, which is going to be called Two Passes, it belongs firmly in the chaps camp. I'm not that keen on geographical explanations. Also, I do think that the fragmentation versus unified organization is, of course, indisputably a major factor. But all the same, this book is taking a very different knack. So let me try to sort of give you an idea of what we're trying to do and get into some of the more the details. To realize what this book is trying to argue is that we're trying to get away from what the political scientists are doing at looking at the state. Arguing that if you want to understand how these economies work and how, as societies, but also as productive units and units of consumption, you really want to look at sort of social organizations. And what social organizations do is they coordinate and organize the production and delivery of local public goods and club goods. Because these were the goods that were actually essential to the functioning of the economy. Things like defense, justice, insurance, local infrastructure, hydraulic project, poor relief, education, all of those things really weren't supplied by the state, or primarily by the state. There's some areas in which the state does intervene, particularly in things like justice and defense, but even there, most of the action is at the local level. And so to get a social organization to that to work, you need spatially specific cooperation. And the question is, how is that achieved? And so, well, we all know about the sort of standard issues that you get from cooperation at the local level. You have to overcome collective action behavior, you have to overcome free riding, other forms of opportunistic behavior. So how does the world solve that, say, around the year 1000? And the answer is that almost wherever you look, local public goods were supplied by extended families. We call them clans, other people have different terms for them, but basically it is these, and so you can sort of see why, right? Because if you're a member of a family, there's a very strong incentive not to engage in opportunistic behavior, because these are your brothers and your cousins and your uncles, you know, you're not going to take advantage of them, and if you do, you know, the whole family will know about it, and, you know, you will not be invited to their bar mitzvah, so, you know, that there's a cost involved in that. And so people, on the whole, in equilibrium, will behave cooperatively when they're dealing with their whole family. And, you know, basically, anthropologists have collected huge amounts of evidence showing that these units are, in fact, coherent and effective units in bringing about cooperation. Now, you know, an economist will immediately realize that these are repeated games of fairly small groups of people who interact, you know, at many levels, and so the incentives to cheat and to do free riding are very small. And so the argument of the book then is that at some point around the year 1000, China and Europe moved in different directions. During the Song dynasty, which is here the dates, and after, increasingly cooperation in China is depending more and more on clans. Before 1000, there actually is a fairly, you know, strong central government that supplies at least some local public goods, and, you know, there are landowners and sort of other things. But the clan as a unit of cooperation becomes increasingly central in the Chinese society, during and following the Song dynasty, say after 1000. And so China, of course, in the year 1000 is an empire. It's a well-organized empire. It collects a lot of taxes that you saw. And it has a bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy it develops a more or less symbiotic relationship with these clans. And they essentially mutually strengthen each other. In particular, in that the clans are assisting the representative of the imperial government in administering, local areas. And so that increasingly, wherever you look, you see that clans more and more provide education, insurance, poor relief, local defense, conflict resolution and justice, and even increasingly so, infrastructural investment. Okay, so they become very much part of the government. It's not the entire government. There isn't, an imperial bureaucracy, but they can't really work without the cooperation of the clans. And so, over time, as you saw, the central government takes less and less income in terms of tax revenue, and that is because much of the spending is carried out by these clans, and whatever taxes they collected, they often depended on the clans to collect them. And so, the literature is actually fairly unanimous about it. There's always some people who say, you're overdoing it, but this actually goes back to the work of an anthropologist called Maurice Friedman. But if you look at recent works like this book by Wang that I showed you, and a paper by Xu and Keller, they all emphasize that all the evidence points to the importance of these clans. Now, depending on a clan-like or extended kinship system, has huge ramifications that, of course, entirely unintentional, because it has been shown by ever-growing literature that extended kinship has major effects on what we would call cultural values. Okay, in particular, you look at the work as say Ben Enke at Harvard, or Joe Hendrick, also at Harvard, and they basically have been arguing with that societies that depend on extended kinship or on clans tend to be much more characterized by what we call a limited morality or communitarian values. And that's to be distinguished from the kind of society that has much more general morality or universalistic values. So, what do I mean by that exactly? So here's a quote from Bernanke, which I think is really actually nice characteristics. Ben says, "A communitarian is a great friend to have, while a universalist is a great stranger to encounter." And that essentially means that in a communitarian regime, you have a small circle of people that you will be extremely loyal to and will cooperate with, whereas everybody else you can free ride on and behave opportunistically. Whereas, in the limit, a universalist basically treats everybody the same. And of course, once you think about it, the intuition suggests that the latter is the one in which you will see much more economic development, because the circle of people with whom you can network is so much larger. So Joe Henrich's book, in particular, and the work of him and his students, it shows that this sort of commitment to moral universalism promotes what they call greater civicness, which I read to be essentially less behavior that you would call opportunistic and free riding. Now, in Europe, the movement goes exactly in the opposite direction. In Europe, the one thing I think that almost everybody agrees on in one form or another, that there's a growing commitment of nuclear, or sometimes we call them conjugal families. Now, the timing is really hard to establish, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't almost know anything about the demographic behavior of the peasants. We know about the aristocrats and the kings and the queens and the dukes, but they may not be representative. They probably weren't. So, what we know is sort of little slivers of information that have been put together. And the further you go back in time, the worse it gets, needless to say. But there still is by now a wide agreement that the drive away from tribes and clans toward nuclear families is to a large extent, maybe to a debate a little bit how large that extent is, driven by the Catholic Church. Of course, nothing like that existed in China. And what emerges is what is now known in the demographic history literature as the so-called European marriage pattern, or the EMP. So there you have it. And it's widely recognized to be part of European exceptionalism, or some people would refer to it as European weirdness. And there's no question that it emerged in medieval Europe. Now, that's not a very precise statement, because medieval Europe is 1,000 years, and we don't know exactly when. It obviously differs from place to place, and so on and so forth. But what is fairly well established, that if you look at the European map, you can draw what is known as the Heinel line. Heinel, after John Heinel, who was the first pointed this out. And if you draw a straight line going essentially from St. Petersburg to Trieste, and everybody to the west of that was subject to the EMP, and people to the east much less so. So what is this European marriage pattern? Well, here are some of its components, and I'm sure some of you have seen these before. So one of them is, of course, late marriage. We know, as soon as the data starts coming up, that European women, men are less relevant for most purposes here, but European women tended to marry late, much later than they would have been biologically warranted, if you thought that the age of menarche was the age at which women got married. Well, in Europe they didn't. They often get married at age, when the data starts coming up, 23, 24, which is way later than you see anywhere else, whether you look at the Middle East or China or any other place. Neolocality. Neolocality means that when a couple gets married, they don't live with her parents or his parents. They established a new household. Monogamy, enforced, very strictly for everybody except, of course, the higher-ups. No divorce. Fairly high rates of celibacy. Okay, and this is not just nuns and monks, which is kind of obvious maybe, but even among the non-religious population, we see unusually high rates of celibacy. Non-consanguineous marriage, meaning you could not marry your cousins or even your second cousins. Now, how they enforce that may be a bit questionable, because you have to have good population registries against it. But people will just testify, say, "Oh no, these people can't marry because they are second cousins." And if that could be shown, then the marriage would be called off. No adoption, very different, say, from Rome. In the Roman Empire, adoption is very common. In Europe, the church was dead set against it. No levirate or sororate. That basically means that if one partner dies, then the remaining partner has the right to demand that the free brother or sister of the deceased marry them. That's probably second order important. It discouraged remarriage of widows and widowers. Also, of course, they couldn't quite prevent this altogether. And finally, and this is very unique, is consensuality. Meaning that when a couple gets married, the woman is asked, "Do you want to marry this man?" Now, that sounds sort of obvious maybe in the 21st century, but it wasn't in the Middle Ages, anywhere else. Basically, most of the world, and including some parts of Europe as well, basically the woman was told by her father, or her guardian, this and this is the guy you're going to marry, off you go. And in a church ceremony, the woman is asked, "Do you want to marry this guy?" Now, of course, you can sort of twist her arm beforehand. I'm not saying that this is necessarily as good as it sounds, but at least the principle has been established. And so, as often happens in history, of course, this pattern that emerges has unplanned and unanticipated consequences. The first thing is that, and this is an interesting literature about this, sort of the girl power literature, after a famous paper by Jan Luiten van Zanten, which basically says that relative to other civilizations, in Europe, women had a great deal more bargaining power and a great deal more autonomy than elsewhere in the world. Secondly, and if you're a Malthusian, this is very important, it meant, because of late marriage, lower fertility. And lower fertility, of course, means in a Malthusian model, higher income per capita, right? Because of the way the Malthusian model works. But most relevant to what we're doing is that it created a world that when we start seeing better data from parish records and, of course, eventually civil registration, it is clear that this has become a continent of nuclear families. The old extended kinship relations as an organizing principle is basically gone. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that extended kinship didn't matter. You still had uncles, and people still had cousins, and they, basically collaborated with them, and there were family firms. And this is not a binary kind of thing. But in economic history, degree is everything. And the degree in which Europeans were organized in nuclear families with a fairly, remote relationship with their more extended family, that, I think, is undeniable. And that, I think, is important. Now, just as a sort of footnote here, this is obviously a critical story. But is it really true, as Henrik and Jonathan Schultz and in a bunch of papers have argued, that this is entirely the result of church policy? And I would think there's probably some economic argument to justify it well. One of them, which the evidence for this is kind of complicated, but I think it makes sense, is the much more importance of livestock in European agriculture. Now, of course, livestock are used all over Eurasia, but the interaction between livestock and arable crops in Europe is much more profound, and therefore there are far more animals than there are in Europe. Now, it turns out that in tending animals, women have a comparative advantage, right? Because you don't need a lot of upper body strength as you do in arable. And so that may have meant many of the components of the EMP. There also is an issue about bilinear descent. So in Europe, really, the family looks for its ancestry. It looks at both sides of the couple. There's both the maternal and the paternal line. And of course, if you then want to engage in extended families instead of looking at your third and fourth rate cousins as part of your community, that gets difficult because the number really starts increasing very quickly. In order to have a lineage-based society, you really need paternal lineages. this paternal descent lineages only. And so Europe always had this bilinear descent, and that is because far more than other societies, it looked at the male and the female partners in a marriage as relatively symmetrical. I say relatively because, of course, it's still a paternalistic society, but less so. Okay? Now, once... Yes, speak up because my hearing isn't great.
So, Joel, it seems to me that some of the values are communitarian versus universal values, and also some features of what you have described as European marriage pattern, they have better chance of surviving if a society is more urbanized versus rural-based society.
Excellent point.
And therefore, the question that comes to my mind is that was urbanization caused by these features, or urbanization facilitated?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm going to come back to it because, in fact, cities are going to play a very important role, not only for the reason that you say, but also because of they become one of the social organizations that replaces the clan. So bear with me for 5 minutes and you will have your answer, I hope. But if you don't, raise the question again. But what I want to point out here, and that's the sort of core question, is the nuclear family is too small a unit to provide these local and club goods that I talked about, right? So this is sort of obvious once you think about it, right? And so what you need is to replace the extended family with something else to solve the collective action problem and enable the supply of these club and local public goods. Because you need cooperation. And so, every economist understands that, right? Because you need a social organization in which members make a credible commitment, not to play opportunistically and to cheat in some kind of repeated game. And you need a mechanism to punish defectors, to minimize off the equilibrium past play, and to ensure some kind of stable cooperative equilibrium. And so what Europeans, and this is sort of the two classic papers by Avner in 2005, 2006, in which he establishes, I think, it's something that had already been in the air, but he formulates it far sharper than anybody else had done. And he points out that in Europe, people formed these cooperative associations, which he calls corporations. Now, the word is confusing because we tend to associate corporations with, big business corporations, and that is actually a descendant of these corporations, the Middle Ages. But of course, what we have in mind here is something that isn't a profit-maximizing sort of outfit, but much more of a social organization in which people cooperate. And so the great bifurcation then that happens around 1000 is that Europe goes in the direction of corporations and China goes more and more toward clan. Now, just as a sort of a footnote, so this is this is not something that anybody planned or anybody could see coming, right? This is a classic, what we call in systems analysis, an emergent property. That is to say, simple actions at the individual level result in very different and far more complex outcomes once you aggregate it up and let time pass. And so in that regard, this is very much like these sort of evolutionary models in which individual behavior leads to these emergent properties of population. In other words, local actions had global consequences. Now let me be a little bit more specific. What are these corporations, right? Now this is by and large a medieval invention made in Europe. There are some, if you push me hard enough, I can find some precedents in Rome, not so much in Greece, but in Rome. But roughly speaking, the form and the shape that it took is a medieval invention. So what it is, it's an association of unrelated people, that's classic, right, for a particular objective. Now the clan is not there for a particular objective. The clan is there basically to help on every dimension that they can. The corporations, in that sense, are more specialized. Secondly, they can create a formal legal entity. You can sue a corporation. And it is an infinite horizon in the sense that, you know, it doesn't die when somebody, a member dies. And it gets a formal charter. And we know in one case when these things were established because, you know, they had to get a formal charter from the ruler. It also is fairly typically delineated membership, right? And so that is necessary because many of these goods are club goods, so you can't enjoy them unless you're a member of the corporation. You could be, and in fact almost everybody was, a member of more than one corporation, unlike being in a clan, you know, you're in my clan or in your clan, but you can't be in both. Well, in corporations, of course, you could. And another thing, very important, they have an exit option. Now, if you're a member of an extended family, as everybody of us realizes, there's no exit option. Even sometimes some people would wish there was, but there usually isn't. And so that's it. You're in there, and of course that means that the degree of competition between these entities is much lower. And usually, most of these corporations were, to some extent, or even to a large extent, self-governing, and they basically write their own bylaws about how things are going to be run. So, what kind of corporations are we looking at here? Now, here's a whole list of them, and you know, they all share the characteristics that I delineated. So you have monasteries, which of course have a religious purpose, urban communes, which basically are a provider of sort of local public goods, and that's your cities, universities, a medieval invention, at least in their current form, guilds, which is another association of unrelated people for a particular purpose, fraternities, militias. I mean, I could make the list longer, but just sort of basically get the idea. Now, none of these are actually sort of profit-maximizing corporations, or so guilds, obviously, where you can think of guilds as some kind of cartel between artisans or people, merchants or people like that. And in fact, you could argue also, this is thin ice we're walking on, that the church itself, at least in its early days, say before the year 400 or 500, was itself a corporation, in the sense that it had an still had an exit option, and so on and so forth. And of course, eventually, much later in the game, you have these business corporations. All right. So the main argument of the book then, and basically this is the sort of takeout, is that the difference in social organizations in providing local and public goods affected the great divergence, or the great reversal, if you want, in many ways. And the sort of four ways in which, I mean, I can think of others, but this is probably covers most of it. One has to do with political institutions, and we have a long chapter, over 120 pages, in which we sort of delineate of how this type of corporate structure affected the political structure of Europe. Culture, in the sense of that I talked earlier, to what extent are we becoming a more universalistic or more localized kind of morality. Then the organization of economic and intellectual life, which sounds vague, but actually we have some fairly detailed description of that. And in the end, and of course now we're coming to the economic reversal, in the end this structure played a very important role in the fact that the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe and not in China. And then of course you see the incomes starting to diverge in terms of the GDP statistics. Now, so let me talk very briefly about the differences in political institutions and how they relate to this. So, you know, one of the sort of cliches of, I suppose, of modern history is that China was never ruled by democratic institutions in its history. In fact, the idea of democracy, I think this comes very naturally to them. Europe was the birthplace of democracy. Now, democracy comes and it goes, right? So the Greek polis eventually fell under aristocracy, and the Roman Republic, which had democratic elements at least, eventually becomes the empire. But in the Middle Ages, as you know, and there's the classic book about this is David Stazowicz's new book on, not so new anymore, on the rise and fall and rise of democracy. But basically, the consensus about why that happens, and this is sort of in part Francis Fukuyama's book and in Walter's book as well. So China achieved unification and built a central state administration early on. That's even before the Song. This is under the Hui and Han dynasties from the 6th century on, whereas Europe remained politically fragmented after the Roman Empire dissolved. And what you get after the Roman Empire, for at least for a time, a long time I should say, is very weak states. Barely existing states is probably the best way of putting it. And there are rulers, there's always somebody who claims to be king, but very strong countervailing and decentralized powers to these rulers. And so the power relationship in Europe are far more symmetric in the sense that people with some power over others, but there's still other people who have power over others. So this is continuous competition between sources of power. Whereas in China, from certainly its history after the Song period, there really never was anything that looked like a countervailing power. There are no inherited sources of power in China. There's no strong local control. There's no feudalism to speak of in China, certainly not, since the Qin dynasty, which is in the year 200 or thereabout. So essentially, there's very few what we would call constraints on the executive, right? There's very few sort of countervailing power on the emperor. So basically, what we think is that there are these effects of early unification and fragmentation, which are amplified and enforced by the internal social organizations of these societies. And so, social organization influence the evolution of political institutions, in things that you see in Europe, but you'll never see in China. One example is the emergence of representative bodies. And so by, say, roughly speaking, 1300, basically everywhere in Europe you see, or almost everywhere I should say, you see some form in which the citizens, now not everybody is a citizen, and who's a citizen is a question, but roughly speaking, there's some body that represents the citizens and that can negotiate with the ruler. And that would be unimaginable in China. What you see in China instead is you see this imperial bureaucracy, and I'll talk a minute about how it was created, which is really critical, which has to negotiate with the local clans, with the local gentry. But this is more of a symbiosis than a negotiation. Basically, you do this for me, I do this for you. And so what you see happening in things start moving in all kind of different direction. For instance, law in Europe becomes very different than it is in China. Now, both are societies in which there is a body of law. I mean, these are not anarchic societies, but they're very different in Europe. And I'll talk about it in a minute. But basically, in Europe, legal rules become ever more powerful and important, to the point where there is a powerful argument made that even rulers are subject to them, which in China, in principle, isn't so. The emperor is above the law. Now, that doesn't mean there's no constraints at all. People can always rebel, but short of that, not much. Now, what is also interesting, of course, that the way in which corporations are organized, as I say, they were sort of self-governing, often is transplanted into the political apparatus. And so we can sort of see this happening between the sort of 11th and 14th century. And that is basically when the European state institutions and when the Chinese system of imperial civil service examinations were fully established. I'll talk about these examinations in a minute. But, here is a very interesting difference between the two societies. Now, needless to say, in both of them there is a ruler and there are people, on the spot, local people, but essentially local organizations are supplying local public goods, and the government, the ruler, rules on that. So things like tax collection and all these other things I talked about earlier, they're always essentially run by local organizations, and that's true in China as well. But the difference is that in Europe, social organizations were anchored in and controlled territory. They are territorial. So, you have a guild, say. Well, this guild is the guild of shoemakers in Cologne, okay? So they're active in Cologne, they're not active in Aachen, okay? And they're also specialized. They're shoemakers, they're not masons. They have nothing to say about the masons, okay? And so they control territory. In China, location is less important. You may have an area in which there are 3 or 4 clans, and each of those clans doesn't control territory, they just control their members. And so that in large part results in the fact that in Europe you get these representative bodies. And so, of course, in Europe we have feudal lords who eventually will go away, but the same is true for monasteries, the same is true for cities. It's all highly territorial. And eventually, the king, or whoever he may be, the duke, or bishop, whoever he may be, has to deal with these people who control a certain amount of territory, and because otherwise, of course, there is always a chance that they could unite against him. Now, one of the striking things about Europe is the existence of autonomous cities. I actually think that is one of the really central features of Europe. In fact, we see, now, China had this period, okay, so there's a period called in early Chinese history called the era of warring states. These are the dates, so this is before the Christian era, but as imperial power becomes stronger during the Qin and Han dynasty, so roughly speaking, between 200 and 600, imperial power becomes stronger, and cities are essentially ruled by representatives, by administrators sent from the capital, and have no autonomy. And in fact, it's very hard to see in China anything like, say, the city of Hamburg or the city of Venice or or even the city of London, which is subject to a ruler but really runs its own show, and if the king intervenes too much, he's in trouble. Okay? So self-governing towns then basically strengthen these national diets or national parliaments, and these parliaments are then convened, and there's a lot of recent literature. Here's a paper by Cox et al. And Angelucci et al. Basically pointing out how important these self-governing cities are. But these are, ladies and gentlemen, these are exactly what I meant when we talked about corporations. And so, sometimes these corporations, they actually become city-states, which actually are traditional from antiquity, because after all, Athens and Sparta and Corinth and even Rome started off as city-states. So this is not in itself an innovation. But the innovation is, of course, the way that they were run. And so, as I said, the government does adopt some of the notions that are developed in these corporations. And in fact, one of them is what was known as a plena potestas. All these things are in Latin, even so they're medieval ideas. Of course, the language that these people dealt with was in Latin. So for plena potestas essentially mean that if you have a representative who is far away from the people he represents, and he's meeting in some kind of diet, he can actually make decisions on his own, rather than having to run back to the town and say, are you guys okay with me voting for this? Basically, once they tell him, hey, you represent us, he can make these decisions independently. Well, then there is a rule called quod omnes tangit, meaning whatever touches all. And that essentially means sort of a right of consent, which is to say, hey, you can't tax me if I end up paying taxes before I consent. So this is sort of the proto-version of no taxation without representation, I suppose. Majority voting, which is, that So there are different majority rules, as you all know, but in guilds and communes, in particular, majority voting is introduced, and only after that these parliaments say, hey, no, we should do that too, and they adopt it from there. Now there's also the whole concept of checks and balances, which comes out of canon law, which is essentially the law of the church, and essentially, the state becomes seen as a legal entity. So, for instance, in Europe, unlike China, a legal official can be sued, which would be unthinkable in China. The idea that you could sue the emperor is ridiculous. You can petition the emperor, people did, but there's nothing that forces the emperor to go one way or another. It isn't so in Europe. The emperor, the king, or whoever he may be, is subject to these laws. So as I said, in China, this sort of territorial control is completely absent. It sort of disappears after the Qin dynasty. And this is sort of what you really get in China is that local control is carried out primarily by what is known very confusingly, and I hate the term, but it's stuck. So this is a Chinese term called jinshen, and it's translated as gentry. But that's a very bad translation, because in England, the gentry are sort of local gentlemen who control an estate. These people don't. These people are essentially sort of senior members of clans who typically have had some education. And so they are considered to be sort of scholarly gentlemen, and they are the ones that actually run the show locally. All right, so let me move on, because there's still a lot of territory to cover here. So the way China runs its show here is something that is utterly unthinkable in Europe, and that is the civil service, the administrative bureaucracy, which is for many centuries much larger than the European one, is selected through a system of meritocracy. Right? There is a system of examination called Keiju, and it emerges fairly early, but it's really fully developed only after the Song and then the Yuan, which are, of course, the Mongols, and so on and so forth. Now, these people, these mandarins, pass the exam, but the passing the exam still means that they are serving at the pleasure of the emperor. They have no independent basis of power. And so they're entirely dependent on the emperor, and they're not really in any way a countervailing power. And in fact, the social examination system is completely dependent and symbiotic with the clan system. So the way it would work is, I don't want to get too detailed into the examination system, but it's a fascinating story, because so every clan will sort of look at the boys. There are only boys taking this exam, and they're sort of picking who's really bright, and they say, well, so and so is the brightest kid in this class, and then they pool their resources, and he studies for 18, 20 years for these really difficult exams. And if he fails, he takes them again. You can take them as many times as you want, but eventually he may run into diminishing returns or something. But if he succeeds, if he becomes an official, and only very few of them succeeded, then in fact the economic benefits that he acquires are dissipated through the members of the clan, because they paid for his education. So this is a sort of an effective system, and somehow if you first look at it and see what happened, you say, hey, meritocracy is really a good thing. You pick people because they're smart and they're well trained, rather than because they picked the right parents, as was the case in Europe. Now, later on, of course, the system becomes a little bit corrupt under Qing, and you can actually buy these positions, but that's a different thing. Now, is there any effective constraint on the executive here? And they had, the emperor really rules by something very vague, which is called the mandate from heaven. Now, what the Chinese have in mind when they think of heaven, it's never been totally clear to me. It's not really a personal God like you see in the Abrahamic religions, but it's something that sends signals more than anything else, perhaps. But what is clear is that for most emperors, the kind of moral behavior that Confucius dictated works as some kind of an informal constraint. But if the emperor was, a violent and cruel man like this guy, the Honghu emperor, who's founding of these are his dates. He basically executed anybody he didn't like. And there were tens of thousands of, various people, soldiers, administrators, landowners who he didn't like. And then he had them killed because he said, I want this guy killed. This is not different, say, that you see in the Roman Empire under Caligula or something like that. And so this local authority then is based on power relations, not on law, and run by these sort of gentlemen scholars. And what is interesting is that when you look at who has power, who is influential, in Europe, more often than not, the more wealth you had, more land usually, or other things, this will give you influence. In the Chinese clan, it's seniority, age, that gives you power. Wealth matters very little. This is a new book by Tai Su Zhang, came out in 2017, that demonstrates this beautifully. Okay? So there. The other thing, as I said, is differences in law. And what you see happening in Europe is that, legal systems emerge more or less, bottom up, heavily influenced by corporations. And much of it is the sort of formalization and standardization of existing practices. Sometimes the existing practices have to be overhauled, of course, but roughly speaking, that's how it is. Now, there is an influence of Roman law, which is reintroduced in Europe in the 11th century, and canon law, which is the church law. But what the net result is, that in Europe, law becomes central to social cooperation, okay? Because in a sense, law becomes a profession. We have scholars studying the law, we have trained judges, we have trained lawyers, we have trained administrators taught at universities, and so on. So legal knowledge becomes a scholarly discipline. And so the fundamental institution in Europe is not just the ruler, it's the ruler and the law. And nothing like that you will see in China. And then certain ideas bubble to the surface. For instance, no one is above the law. Now, that's a theory. In practice, we all know, some people are more above the law than others. There are even more ideal notion of equality before the law, which is, of course, an even bigger fiction. But at least the theory imposes certain constraints on you. And as I said, it becomes professionalized, and much of the ideas actually come out of sort of Christian doctrine and so on. So there's a complicated story there, which I will now skip. In China, there are codes of law, but basically what emerges in China and mixes quite in a complicated way with Confucianism, something called legalist doctrines, called Fajia. And this is a body of thought that basically says the law is there to serve the emperor and to impose discipline and order on society. So this is, you might call this rule, not rule of law, but rule by law. So the emperor basically writes down these codes, and the biggest item is rebellion. If you disobedience to the emperor, what the emperor can do to you. You do horrible things you don't want to know, but basically that's the idea. So legalism is in some ways based on what you'd almost call a Hobbesian view of society. A strong ruler should harshly enforce laws, and these are laws that he comes up with, and his subjects have nothing to say for it. So what you have is criminal law, and you have political law, but you don't have much of civil law. That doesn't mean there's no civil law, it just means it's not really codified. The way disputes are resolved in China, as opposed to in Europe, is by arbitration. And the arbitration happens within the clan, and the elders of the clan are the ones who basically adjudicate. Now, when you have, inter-clan disputes, it gets more complicated and they have to compromise, but even then the clans negotiate with each other rather than going to court. Going to court in China was possible, and courts existed, but you have to understand they were run by magistrates, which are the sort of local envoys that the emperor sent to each district. Now each magistrate has to run lots of other things apart from being a judge. And the worst part is that he was, by construction, unfamiliar with local conditions, because these magistrates rotated every 4 or 5 years. They would go from one region to another. So once they got acquainted with local conditions, they said, okay, it's time to go, and you go somewhere else, and you have to start all over again. Meaning they were basically clueless, and they were told what and they did what senior clan members told them to do. And so this is essentially, these are totally different things. So let me talk a little about the weirdness of Europe, okay? So Europe was different, and this is, of course, a book that many of you have seen. This is Joe Hendrick's book, and it's, it takes a somewhat different tack than we do, because Joe's an anthropologist and a psychologist, and I know some economics, but that's not his main interest. It's a fantastic book. It will annoy a lot of people, and it did annoy a lot of people, but that's how scholarly advances. But what Joe and other people have argued is this kind of difference creates a different value system. Okay? In Europe, what you see is a social hierarchy based on contractual reciprocity. It's a much more universalist or more generalized morality, and it creates the conditions for a much more individualist outlook on law, which is kind of what you'd expect in a world that consists of nuclear families, right? So there's a book by this British philosopher, Larry Siedentop, basically argues that this is precisely what sets the two worlds apart, that individualism emerged in Europe in the Middle Ages as a result. Mostly blames religion. We think there are other things. But essentially the idea is that all people are equal in front of God, not something that the Chinese would ever come up with. And that people have some rights which are inalienable. Okay, so it's economic, civil, political perhaps. And you get, in documents, you can see these things. Now, you have to take this with a grain of salt, but things like the Magna Carta, which is in many ways maybe not representative, but you sort of get the idea. We have rights, and you will not take these rights away from us. And in China, this is very different. Okay, it's dominated by a kin-based morality, by a collectivist society, deeply supported with and symbiotic with Neo-Confucian doctrine as formulated during the Song dynasty, mostly by a guy called Zhu Qi, who lived from 1130 to 1200, and is basically followed after Confucius, the most influential philosopher in Chinese history. And what does it involve? It involves respect for hierarchy, age, ancestor worship, and whatnot. So there's collective responsibility, for instance, something you see very little of in Europe, and on and on. All right. So, I'm basically going to skip this and at least have spent a few minutes on the big question that you've all been waiting for. But just to summarize, okay, so Europe is different. Corporations versus clans, marriage and reproduction patterns, different political institutions, different value systems. So that leaves just one small, or maybe not so small, question. All right, so here is, I'm not going to be able to deal with all of it, but I want to argue here that this is the background of the Industrial Revolution, okay, and that the economic divergence you see after 1750 or 1800 is rooted in this kind of divergence, okay? It didn't sort of occur suddenly that Europeans said, hey fellas, let's have an industrial revolution, and nothing like that, okay? So what I need to do is establish links between this sort of divergence that I described and the Industrial Revolution. And so essentially there are about 5 major linkages that I can think of, and I'm going to be able to spend time on all of them, but just sort of you will get the flavor. So there are 5 basic linkages, and the first one I'm very keen on, and that's to do with what I call intellectual ancestor worship. And so, so what intellectual ancestor worship is? This is sort of a very common historical trait in which each society has a sense of inferiority vis-a-vis people who lived before them as being wiser, better informed, and smarter than themselves. And so they have this sort of canon, which people call canon of ancient wisdom. Okay, so it could be, and for a Muslim this would be the Quran and the Hadith. You know, and for the Jews this is the Old Testament and the Talmud, and for Christians it's the writer of the the New Testament and the writings of the Church Fathers. In China it's the Neo-Confucian writings of Zhu Qi, and so on and so forth. So every, or almost every society we can think of has this canon, and the question is, how much are you, constrained by that canon? And so, for instance, my own forefathers, European Jews, strongly committed to the Holy Scriptures, and whenever, when they ever had a problem and they didn't know the answer, they say, "Oh well, you'll dig in the Talmud, and you will find the answer." And if you dig hard enough, you'll find some kind of answer. But this is a statement that I dug out of the Talmud, and you'll sort of see what an intellectual worship looks like. Okay, so if those who were before us, in Hebrew, Rishonim, were like angels, we are but man. And if those who were before us were like men, we are but asses. Okay, there was this sense of inferiority vis-a-vis earlier generations. And most societies have some of that. Also in our own age, I must say, it seems to have subsided to the point where it may well eventually asymptotically go down to zero, until you show up in this crazy evolutionary museum in Kentucky, I believe, where you actually still see there's a creation museum which is wholly based on the biblical story of evolution. People actually believe that garbage. So, even in the United States, why aren't you surprised? This kind of stuff continues. Now, if you look at the intellectual history of Europe, you see that much of the Middle Ages was actually in that pattern. The great guru of knowledge was Aristotle. Okay, and so people read Aristotle on everything, not just on philosophy and on logic, but also on physics and anything you wanted. Okay, but there were others, on geography, Ptolemy, on natural history, Pliny, on medicine, Galenus, and so on. This is the stuff that was taught at university. This is what people read. If you needed to know something, that's where you're starting to look. Now, at the end of the Middle Ages, say by 1450, and this is fairly fun and interesting to document, you can see sort of people looking at these writings. Many of it had just, by the way, discovered in the previous 200 years, which is what I call the Renaissance, and basically say, you know what, this looks good, but it's wrong. And, there's these long debates about various things, and you can sort of say the most famous events, of course, are Copernicus' description of the universe, and then, of course, eventually Galileo backing him up, and everybody knows the famous story about Galileo. But this is, in fact, very widespread, and it's called sometimes sort of the famous war between the ancients and the modern. Les querelles des anciens et des modernes, and basically. By 1700, this is over. I mean, the moderns have won. Nobody with his right mind would say that Newton, and earlier astronomers, didn't make a major improvement on the kind of picture of the world that was drawn by Ptolemy. Now, in China, precisely because Confucianism had such a reverence for the past, because it was your ancestors, they had to decline, that you look back and clearly there is a growing veneration of people's ancestors. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say that ancestor worship necessarily implies intellectual ancestor worship, but there's some evidence, I'll cite the paper in a minute, that it actually did. But basically, the works that I mentioned, Zhu Qi already, he wrote these sort of famous 4 books, the Shizhu Zhichu, and that remains as strict and as rigid a canon as there ever was. And then really, until the last decades of the empire, even in the closing decades of the 19th century, this is still true. Even so, people are getting slowly exposed to Western influence. And so, ancestor worship, then, is very pervasive in China, because that's what you do in a clan. The ancestors what keeps you guys together. In Europe, that's not done. I mean, I see very little evidence of any form of ancestor worship. And in fact, one of the reasons that intellectual ancestor worship is so vulnerable is because people really aren't sort of bred into this veneration for earlier generations. And so, now ancestor worship also means other things. It means that, you know, you don't see in China sort of kind of class struggles between the few and the many over economic issues like, you know, Marxists would have it. Because in China, you know, the identity is not with your class, but it is you with your extended family. There's all kind of other implications here. But in fact, there is a paper by Chi-Chen Ma that actually shows that places in which there were shrines to ancestors were slower to adopt modern industries at the time, you know, late in the 19th century, when China finally starts bringing in some European techniques. So I find that sort of encouraging. Now, I have 10 more minutes left, but I'm going to at least give you one very important component that I haven't gotten to. And that is a cooperation of intellectuals. So what emerges in Europe, and some of this is based on my 2016 book, I must say, but basically what you see emerging in Europe is a community, transnational, trans-religion, all over the sort of European continent, all the way to Krakow and later on St. Petersburg, all the way to Dublin and all the way from Oslo to Lisbon, in which there is a network based on essentially correspondence between scholars who trade information, who trade opinions, who trade suggestions, who read each other's work. I mean, in a way, that what is known as the Republic of Letters, as it's called, we still have that. Also, we use more modern tools. But the Republic of Letters, as I argued in that book at some length, is critical in understanding how Europe reached the Industrial Revolution, because it is essentially the foundation of a market for ideas that is competitive, that is open, and that, you know, probably gets as efficient as these things ever will get. Now, it's not a regular market, and therefore, you know, efficiency is clearly sort of a much more ephemeral thing, but there you have it. But it is in some ways a corporation. Now, it deviates from my definition of corporations a little bit. For instance, there's no membership that's official, like you're a member of a guild or a monastery. Okay, they say there you really are admitted, and you almost get like a membership card. But it has some features that we associate with corporations. First, it's independent of formal political structures. It's an association of like-minded people who were almost never related. In fact, many of them didn't even meet each other ever. Now, it set rules, much like monasteries and cities do. Well, you know, the enforcement of these rules is, of course, difficult. But it basically has to do with, you know, the prohibition on plagiarism, widely violated, I should say, reproducibility of experiments, you know, checking people's proofs of mathematical theorems, and things like that. Okay, so it set rules, and these rules were in some ways enforced, in the sense that if you got caught by, you know, committing plagiarism, you know, I mean, nobody would arrest you, but it wouldn't be good for your reputation, and this is heavily based on reputation. And of course, eventually, the Republic of Letters spills over into real corporations like universities, scientific academies, and the like. Okay? All right, so finally, and I think I'll probably have to stop there because I'm running out of time, but there's the universities. And the universities are, again, a unique European institution. There were some attempts to have them here, like in India, for instance. In Bihar, you had Nalanda University, but it was a single case, and it died. Whereas in Europe, you get a network of universities. You know, it starts small, of course, but by 1400, there are lots of them all over Europe. And the nice thing about it is that they, are autonomous in the sense that they write their own rules, and secondly, that they are not coordinated. They compete with each other. And that turns out to be a crucial thing, because as often is the case in a fragmented system, competition works. Now, So there is all this work by David Lacroix who has sort of quantified this. But I think the fundamental story that's relevant to us is that yes, these are corporations in the classic sense of the word, of course. But the nice thing about it is that it in some ways encapsulates and is emblematic of how European society worked. Because you see, most of these universities were extremely conservative. Don't think of them as isles of progress. I mean, research, yeah, if you wanted to do research, you did research. If you didn't want to do research, you didn't. It's not at all like what any of you would be familiar with. So few people at universities did research, not because they had to, but because they liked it, like, you know, say, Newton sitting at Trinity College in Cambridge. But the nice thing about it is that even though most universities are conservative, there's always some places, a few of them, where there is serious progress being made. Now, it's not always the same place, but you know, you don't need all of the universities to be progressive. You need a few of them. And so the most famous ones, I think, is the University of Padua, where, of course, Galileo taught as a young mathematician, but many other people taught there. Vesalius, the founder of modern anatomy. Copernicus was a student there. I mean, this is the place you went to if you wanted to advance. Now, later on, Padua falls in hard times for political reasons, and it moves elsewhere. So it moves to Leiden in the Netherlands, and then later on to Edinburgh, and of course, it keeps still moving around, but there's always some place where progress is being carried out. And that is really important. And then, here's one footnote to this. If people thought the universities didn't do their job and did not enhance knowledge as they felt it, they could create other corporate organizations. And these corporate organizations actually play a very important role. So these are these so-called scientific societies and academies that start popping up in Europe, I would say early on in the 17th century. You see the first one. The most famous of those is something called the Accademia dei Lincei, the Academy of the Links, where Galileo was a member and others. And so, but they are all over Europe, and in some ways they compete with universities. Now, you know, it's a more complicated story. Funding is always an issue, as you can imagine. The most famous of these, of course, is the Lunar Society, which plays a critical role in the Industrial Revolution, where some of the great inventors of the Industrial Revolution participate. And so you could actually say that the kind of social organizations that emerged in Europe create what I have called an industrial enlightenment. And basically what the industrial enlightenment is in part about is, yes, we want to bring about progress, but how do we do it? And the answer they gave is people who knew things have to communicate with people who made things. So artisans and manufacturers, fabricants, the French would call them, would have to meet what we would call scientists, and they called natural philosophers or savants. And by getting these people together, having them exchange ideas and talk to each other, what comes out is something larger. But again, think about it. This does not ever happen within the family. This happens among people who don't know each other, or who know each other very superficially, but they have to trust each other. And why do they trust each other? Because by that time, Europe has developed this kind of universalist look at the world, in which when you meet somebody that you've never met before, who's not a relative, you can still, at least a priori decide, I can trust this person until I do updating, and sometimes they don't. I can, and sometimes I can't. But at least this kind of interaction, I would argue, was not really thinkable in China. And in fact, it's almost completely absent. Now, there are people who know things. Most of the people who have taken the imperial examination. So there are highly educated intellectuals and philosophers. In fact, the literacy rates in China may, in fact, have been somewhat higher than in Europe. Also, literacy in a Chinese system is sort of hard to define, but that's a different story. But the education that they got meant that they were never interested in practical technological matters. They did not study math, they did not study physics. astronomy only to the point where they needed it for the purposes of the rituals that they performed, and in fact they fell behind very seriously the Europeans in the 17th century, to the point where there's this famous event in which these Jesuit astronomers show up in China and they have this famous contest, who can predict the next lunar eclipse better, and the Europeans beat them by a huge margin, which was kind of very edifying, I guess, for a European. And so that, I think, is a sort of a consequence of the form of social organizations that you see in China. Now, the other thing, of course, and that sort of comes back to your question, we have these autonomous cities. And much of the intellectual innovation that happens in Europe, that drives economic progress, is an urban phenomenon. And it's an urban phenomenon because these cities were autonomous, and so you can't have in a city some kind of ruler who says, hey, you know what, you should, if you do this and that, you're a heretic and we're going to string you up or, torture you or whatever. If you thought there was a ruler like that, you pick your suitcases, you go to the next cities. And there are always these cities. Here's 5 of them. I already mentioned Padua and Edinburgh, but you think of Basel, you think of Rotterdam, you think of Strasbourg. These are cities that basically run their own show. Nobody's going to tell them what to do. And that sets them apart from people who are, living in a society where you have some kind of, overall ruler who can basically decide what is true and what is false. And if you think that what the ruler thinks is false, and the ruler doesn't like that, you leave. And people did. And they left all over. Always remember that Locke's essay on toleration was written in the Netherlands, and Hobbes' Leviathan was written in Paris, because at that time the government in England didn't like them. So they went somewhere else and they wrote them afterwards, and eventually they went back, because of restoration. But that's basically the sort of pattern in Europe. In China, ladies and gentlemen, if the emperor didn't like you, there was nowhere to go. That makes a huge difference. I'm sort of out of time, so I'm going to skip all this as I threatened you. But I want to give you the conclusions, then I'll shut up. So, the great divergence in GDP and in living standards and in technological capabilities may have been a fairly late phenomenon, I think. But its roots go back to the early Middle Ages, when social organizations in China and the West started to evolve in very different directions. So if you think that the great divergence started with the Industrial Revolution, as I don't, but some people do, the Industrial Revolution was not a cause of the great divergence, but an unintended, unanticipated consequence of much deeper and much earlier historical forces. And so the Industrial Revolution is not the start of the great divergence, but its culmination. Thank you. Sorry, I warn you, I take too much time.
Do we have time for questions?
Maybe only 2.
Two.
Okay.
I'm looking at the organizers.
1 or 2.
2. All right.
All right.
Okay, one here and...
Okay.
All right.
Speak up.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Professor, for a nice lecture. So I have just a small query related to, there are some scholars in the global south from the field of political economy and political science. So they have tried to explain this divergence on the basis of colonization. So do you find any scope to include colonization in your theory?
I would, but I would say this. It is not an accident, perhaps, that the North, and I don't like the North and South distinction, but basically Europeans, Westerners, call them what you want, colonized other parts of the world and not the other way around. There is, at least in theory, there is no reason why you could not have, Africans or Asians sailing to Europe. They had, particularly here in Southern Asia, the ships that they had in 1500 were better than the ones the Europeans would. They could have sailed exactly the way Vasco da Gama did, gone to Portugal and established, the Lisbon Company and basically started exploiting the Europeans. doesn't happen, okay? Europeans end up all over the world. Once they're there, of course, they're not choir boys. These people are trying, to steal and rob and exploit and enslave as much as they can. But the question is, why could they do this to the global south, as you call them, and not the other way around? Now, early in the Middle Ages, of course, that is what's happening, because you see, in fact, people not so much from the Middle East. So, Muslim society invades much of Europe, and they take, all of Spain, at least for a while, southern part of Italy, much of what we get in the Balkans. So it can happen, but in the end, the West prevails, and by 1800, essentially, the game is over. And so, yes, once you are ahead, you can use that advantage to get even more ahead. And that's what I think colonialism is. But to say, look, Europeans got rich because they robbed the whole world, that I think is a very partial answer. That would be, but you have to ask yourself the basic question. Why could they get away with it? Why did Columbus discover America and not, some Inca chief or some Aztec chief end up in Dublin or someplace like that? It just doesn't happen. And that's, for history is not only about what happened, it's about what didn't happen. And that's, I think, where the answer is. Yes?
So I have to follow up on a very similar doubt. So where you had put in a slide which talked about the fiscal capacities of the two parts.
Yes.
And so over there, is this also an underlying factor, because the colonizers could impose high inflation and the mercantilism that was evident. So was that also intertwining with the cultural differences that you have shown and talked about?
Well, I think so. Look, here is, let me, most of you will know this story, but there is, in the 15th century, there is a serious attempt of, and this is the best thing I know best about, by Chinese to sail around away from China and start exploring the world, okay? The man who was in charge of it was actually a Muslim of all things, and he was a eunuch named Zheng He. And Zheng He's voyages started in, I think, 1403 and ended in, I believe, 1437. So this is a substantial period of time. The ships Zheng He used were superior to anything the Europeans could even dream about. They were far more seaworthy. They had better navigation technique. They sail all around India. They get into the Red Sea. They sail all the way through to Bab el-Mandeb. This is the beginning of the Chinese age of exploration, you would think, except that a new emperor comes to power instead of the previous one, and he says, hey, what is this nonsense? It's costing me money. I don't like this. We Chinese, we don't need to learn anything from these barbarians. There's nothing to learn. We stop this. Not only that he stopped the voyages, he burned the shipyards. He prohibited the building of these further ships. He executed, this is the way they do things in China, the people who knew how to do that. The knowledge disappeared. And so, why is it that, 50 years later, Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Magellan and all these other guys start sailing around, and instead of some emperor or some king saying, hey, what are you doing? You're wasting our money, they basically say, well, if you're not going to pay me, I'm going to go to the next guy. All right? And that is precisely, by the way, what happened with Columbus, because he first went to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese king said, nah, I'm not interested. So he went to the Spanish, and voila. And that keeps happening all the time. And so, in that, to think of colonialism and imperialism and, all these things as a sort of an independent actor, an exogenous variable, that's a major error of identification. It's the language you will understand.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
I believe we have to end this session. I wish this could go on because it's a really fascinating discussion, but I hope the book comes out and we do get to follow up on it and read up. Thank you. It's really lots of things to think about.
Good.
Thank you.
All right. This is, yeah. Okay, all right.